Are you done? Are we recording? Okay. Okay, great. So my name is Soledad. My English pronouns are she, her, and I'm the lead volunteer for this public forum. We begin by acknowledging the lands on which we gather today. Science and Policy Exchange, SPE, is based on Yoyege or Montreal, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Genyangehaga, also known as Mohawk, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connection with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationship with the Yoyege or Montreal community. We further acknowledge the deep ties between colonialism and modern Western science and research, especially in Yoyege, where it is host to a large research ecosystem. We encourage our participants and everyone to challenge their own ties to systems of oppression that have marginalized Indigenous communities. Today's event aims to foster a discussion regarding the impact of misinformation on nutrition and how to combat it. The event includes presentations by 3 expert panelists, followed by a question and answer session. So let me give you some brief technical instructions. We have some neat features today. If you like to ask questions, you can use the Q&A button below for questions, and you can actually upvote questions that you like and that you would like also to know the answers, since questions will be answered in popularity order. You're welcome to ask your questions in English or French. If you ask your question in French, an SP volunteer will provide an English translation for the moderator. We invite you to use the chat to introduce yourself or share resources. However, we ask that you post all questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. Please note that questions or comments that are inappropriate or off topic may be removed. Okay, so I would like to ask Emma, should I introduce Emily, our moderator, or we go directly to introducing maybe Jean-Claude by you?
I'll take over from here. Thank you very much, Soledad. Good evening, everyone. My name's Emma Anderson. I'm the Public Forum Coordinator at Science Policy Exchange. Fortunately, we had a small mix-up with our moderator. I think it's because she's in Europe and maybe there was a bit of a mix-up with the time zones, but she hasn't managed to make it to the event, so I will be taking over from her. So I'd like to start off by introducing our 3 expert panelists who are representing the social, research, and policy aspects of the issue of nutrition in the age of misinformation. So first off, I would like to introduce Dr. Jean-Claude Mubarak. He is a professor in public health and global nutrition at the University of Montreal and researcher at CRESP, the Center for Public Health Research at the University of Montreal. So he is an anthropologist, a professor in public and international nutrition at the Department of Nutrition at UDM. He is a researcher and at the Center de Research en Santé Publique, as well as the World Health Organization Transnut Collaboration Center. He is interested in food systems, the role of the kitchen, and the impact of food processing on nutrition, health, and society, public policies aimed at healthy eating, as well as behavior of actors in the food system, including the agro-food system and industry. Next up, we have Honorable Carolyn Cochran. She's the Premier of the Northwest Territories, Minister of Executive and Indigenous Affairs. She was elected Premier in 2019 and is the 2nd female Premier in the territory's history. She's a 2 term member of the Legislative Assembly and served as a minister in the previous government's cabinet. She held a variety of portfolios, including housing, education, municipal and community affairs, public works and services, worker safety and compensation commission, and status of women. She currently holds a portfolio of executive and Indigenous affairs. Of Métis descent, Premier Cochran holds a degree in social work and has 20 years of experience in administration and direct service provision within accredited agencies that support high-risk families. Finally, we have Dr. Hassan Hutchinson. Right now, he's an associate with the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University and the former Director General of the Office of Nutrition Policy and Promotion of Health Canada. Dr. Hutchinson serves on the Policy Advisory Group at the World Cancer Research Fund, on the advisory board of Toronto Metropolitan University's Center for Studies in Food Security, on UNICEF's expert board of UNESCO, and for the previous decade, Hassan was Director General of the Office of Nutrition Policy Promotion. Before, he was Associate Director of the Institute of Nutrition, Metabolism and Diabetes at the Canadian Institute of Health Research. Prior to working in the public service, Hassan was a faculty member in the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery at McGill University. So I would like to welcome these three expert panelists and thank them very much on behalf of Science Policy Exchange for volunteering their time for this event. And with that, I would like to kick off the first presentation with Dr. Jean-Claude Mubarak. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, for this nice presentation. You can see my screen now, my sound. All good?
Yes.
Great. So thank you for this kind invitation. I like the idea expressed that we should think and trying to get rid of all forms of oppression. So my presentation will be along those lines. I'll be talking about what I believe is one of the root causes of misinformation today, which is the role of corporate political activities. So first, let me remind us that today, all nations, all societies are facing two major burdens. One is climate change. The other is all forms of malnutrition. In Canada, we are struggling with climate change, and we are also struggling with obesity and chronic diseases that are getting higher and higher. There's also an important proportion of Canadians that are food insecure. And although climate change and malnutrition are two different things, they have some common cause. And one of those common causes are the nature of our food systems. Today, our food systems are very efficient in terms of production. However, they produce a lot of unhealthy products and they create a lot of pollution for the environment. And so the United Nations, the WHO recognizes that all governments have to reform and transform their food systems so that they become more healthy and sustainable. And WHO also recognizes that the private sector influences is a key obstacle to the advance of public policies. So I'll be talking about this today. Now, the WHO defines the commercial determinants of health as an important concept. What are commercial determinants of health? Here are some definitions in the literature. So there are strategies and approaches used by the private sector to promote products and choices that are harmful to health. For example, when soft drink companies are using marketing to promote their product, they are promoting products that are harmful to health. Another definition is that they are commercial determinants of health are goods or services for which there is an inherent tension between commercial and public health objectives. I like this definition because it talks about a tension between commercial and public health objective. And I'll give you an example on why this tension exists in our food system. So here's an example. On the right, we have our latest Canadian food guide, which invites Canadians to make water the drink of choice. And this policy, this food guide, is in contradiction with marketing on soft drinks that are proposing another message, which is to choose soft drinks if one is thirsty. Now, this is just one example. On one side, I understand that food companies must use marketing and other forms of strategies to promote the product. This is part of what they need to do in terms of business. This is a legal obligation from them to promote their product. However, for some product like tobacco, or in this case, soft drinks, there is a tension and a contradiction between the promotion of those products and the promotion of healthy recommendation, which are in contradiction. And because of this contradiction, we can understand and explain more the commercial determinants of health. Now, the commercial determinants of health takes many forms. Marketing is one form. Another form is what I'll be talking about today, are corporate political activities. Corporate political activities are one type of commercial determinants of health. So what are those activities? Well, they are strategies used by the food industry to influence public policies and public opinion in ways favorable to the firm, sometimes at the expense of public health. For example, when a soft drink company uses lobbying to fight a regulation on soft drink, it is part of this definition. There's different types of corporate political activities. Some are coalition management. So industry is trying to approach health professional organization to trying to create a dialogue, collaboration, to trying to downplay the role of their product in the obesity pandemic. Another type of CPA is information management. I'll be talking about that today because the topic of today is nutrition in the era of misinformation. So companies are using different types of activities to manage the information about nutrition. And I want to talk about this today because, of course, if one manages the information, it does affect and influence the nature of our food policies, which are based on evidence and science. Corporate political activities have been studied extensively in the literature. First, they were studied in the area of tobacco. And now today they're studied in the area of food and nutrition. And over the world, different research in different countries have found similar results. So basically, what are the types of influence of CPA on science and policy? Well, they can prevent or block food policies. By lobbying or by funding research, they can discourage government to advance a specific type of policies, for example, the front of package labeling. They can also maintain policies that are less effective but favorable to the industry, such as voluntary reformulation. They can also mislead and sow doubt in science. And so, of course, if one is misleading science, this necessarily affects the quality of information available to scientists, to decision makers, to students. And so we can see how the misleading of science can lead to misleading in nutrition and information. They can also confuse the public mind, creating cacophony or confusion around what is known about nutrition today. I'll be giving some example so that this could be more clear. And they can also undermine the credibility of professionals and scientists, mostly when those activities involve scientists. For example, a company may employ a scientist to produce research that will be favorable to the industry. So that will undermine the credibility of scientists in the end. And so who are the people at risk from those CPAs? Well, health and food policies, of course. I think this is one reason why Health Canada chose to exclude industry from the last food guide consultation, and Hassan will be talking about that. But also CPAs can influence health professional and organization through influencing and changing the content of scientific events. Also by influencing the training program that students and health professionals are attending. And also it can also influence student career and the curriculum of the programs in the different Department of Nutrition. And for the public, it could lead to confusion in the public mind. Now, let me give you some example of CPAs indicating in context so you can maybe understand more my previous slides. So here's one example. In 2014, the Simon Fraser Institute, not the university, the institute, published a report on obesity in Canada, stating that the problem was overstated and the policy solution were misguided. Now, in this report, there's a lot of errors, false assumption, and cherry picking in order to arrive to this conclusion. I don't want to discuss the nature of the report. What I want to show is how this report influenced the types of news that we saw in the days after the release of the report. So for example, after the report, one could read in CTV News that the Canadian obesity epidemic is a myth, finally. Or the National Post reported that Canada's obesity epidemic is exaggerated and the health risk overstated. Now, it doesn't really matter if the report from the Fraser Institute was good or bad. The fact is that after the release of the report, the information of the report led to misinformation in the news. And one can understand how citizens, health professionals, students can be influenced after reading those news, saying, well, perhaps there is no obesity, epidemic of obesity, or perhaps we shouldn't act to address this epidemic. Another example is when industry funds research. And so, for example, here's one review that showed that there are financial conflict of interest and reporting bias regarding the association between sugar-sweetened beverages and weight gain. Studies funded by industry tend to conclude that there is no link between sugar-sweet beverages consumption and obesity, while studies not funded by industry tend to have an opposite conclusion. So one can see how funding research through corporate political activities can lead to a bias in nutrition information. Another example is linked to my specific research. So I specialize in the role of ultra-processed food in diet and health. And we have shown in Canada that almost half of the calories consumed by Canadians are from ultra-processed food. And we've shown that the more ultra-processed food is consumed, the less is the quality of the diet, and the higher is the risk for obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and other health outcomes. And because this research is pinpointing at a specific type of food, so ultra-processed includes soft drinks, salty and sweet snacks, breakfast cereals, fast food, a whole range of products. So this, of course, displeases some sectors of industry. And so it was in 2017, we saw a paper in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition published by researchers linked to the industry, linked to Nestle and other industries, in which they were attacking and discrediting the concept of ultra-processed food. And the problem is that in this paper, there was a lot of errors, false assumption, and false claims about our work on ultra-processed food. So this is very troubling. We wrote to the review asking to maybe address those problems. They refused to retract the article. So we had to publish an answer in another journal. And in that journal, in that paper, we explain the inaccurate statements and the rebuttal that was mostly based on false assumption and false claims. And so I invite you to read those papers because they are a good example on how industry can fund and publish research that is biased, and how researchers now need to address those biases by publishing a rebuttal letter. Another example is that we've seen in the recent years a lot of article on social media and in the press attacking or defending ultra-processed food. And it's interesting because we have the same author publishing five same texts, but in different media. So if you go to those links, you'll see that it's the same text word by word in different types of media. And this, to me, makes me think about press release. It seems that there is someone or an institution that writes a criticism of ultra-processed food and asks author to publish those in different media. So maybe to influence society, health professionals, and researchers. So this is to me very troubling, because when you read those articles, there is also false assumption behind the criticism. And so one last example, in Quebec, we have a company that has the objective to lead in the domain of communication in the sector of agro-industry. And they have magazines, they have an annual event, and they have a TV channel through which they communicate nutritional information. And it's interesting to see that through those media, they don't talk about ultra-processed food. There's some concepts and some words that they're not using in a way to maybe provide a better images of processed food. So I think this is interesting. And my conclusion is that disinformation leads to misinformation. So in French, we have two different definitions for those concepts. I'm not sure if we have the same in English, but in French, disinformation is when the information is false and the person spreading it knows it is false. So it's a deliberate and intentional lie, which shows that people are being actively misinformed by malicious actors. In my perspective, corporate political activities are creating disinformation. It is not an error. It's an intentional action to discredit part of the evidence because it goes against the interest of the private sector. And so when industry is funding research, when they are spreading false news, they are actually influencing the way social media and the mass media is reporting the news, which leads to misinformation. Because misinformation is when the information is false, but the person spreading it believes it to be true. So I believe that disinformation leads to misinformation, and that we need to monitor, control, and prevent corporate political activities to support and protect evidence-based nutrition education, intervention, and policies to transform our food system. And if we don't address those strategies, we're going to be fighting years and years to try to convince Canadian citizens that we need strong food policies to address both climate change and malnutrition in all its forms. And in the end, if we don't act, it's like letting the corporate capture of society happening without intervening. And so thank you for this invitation, and I look forward for the discussion with my fellows today.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. It is quite concerning, the influence that corporations have in our food systems. And I think it even expands beyond just nutrition, even in terms of fertilization and other things like that. But one thing I thought was really interesting is that since you do research related to ultra-processed foods, I did hear of a policy in Brazil where they were putting food labels on ultra-processed foods. So it would be interesting to hear your opinion later on about whether that's a potential idea that Canada could implement, but let's leave that for the question and answer panel discussion. So thank you very much. Moving on, we're going to have our second presentation from our social panelists, which is Premier Carolyn Cochran, the Premier of the Northwest Territories. And with that, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Premier Cochran. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for the invite. I'm really pleased to be here, actually. I want to start by acknowledging the land that I'm presenting on. These are treaty lands and home to Métis people, the Akecho-Dene and the Clicho within the Northwest Territories. So I'm grateful to be presenting from this land as well. I'm here to talk about food security in the Northwest Territories and the challenges and the barriers that residents face in accessing healthy food in a perpetual food desert, actually, and the historical context that has put many Northerners at a disadvantage. I think it's always important when we do research to actually have a human face. Sometimes we forget that, and science is intriguing and interesting, but unless you can actually relate, I think that we're doing a little bit of disservice. So I'm going to try to do that. So my degree is in social work, as stated, and I spent more than 2 decades working with low-income families, really struggling in the nonprofit sector, and the nonprofit sector struggles itself, and the families that access those services are often in dire needs of support, including income supports. Finances is always an issue. So on the other problem is that food is not only about nutrients, it's also a really vital part of culture, well-being, and of course, health. Food security is essential to making healthy choices and in being able to live our best lives. The research always shows there's a link between wholesome food choices and healthy eating, and having access to affordable and nutritious food is vital to improving the health and well-being of people and communities. I do believe, however, that food security and misinformation affects low-income families more than higher-income families, and I'll try to explain that as I go forward. Food security and healthy eating are often a luxury that people take for granted, and it's a luxury that low-income families can't often afford or make choices in. They often have to take what they can get. I'll start by providing a little context of the Northwest Territories, so it'll help set the stage for understanding some of the issues that we face when it comes to food security and misinformation. So slide 2 does show the Northwest Territories. If I can get, yeah, it shows we're huge. We're a total of area of 1,346,000 square kilometers. That's an area that's twice the size of Texas, 1/6 of the area of Canada. So we're quite a huge area of land that doesn't have a lot of infrastructure, very few road systems, but I'll get into that later. Slide 3, the next slide, shows that our population is just over 44,000 people, 44,732 on our last census. And when you talk about 44,000 people in a jurisdiction twice the size of Texas, it tells you we don't have a huge tax base, and there's a lot of issues with being in that size and low population. The next slide talks about our population. With over half of the people in the Northwest Territories being indigenous, Inuit people, First Nations, and Métis are the majority of our population. And they're represented throughout the territories. We have 2 reserves in the territories that are funded by fall under the federal system, but the rest of them are all territorial. And I do have to state that the majority of non-Indigenous people actually live in our regional capital, actually, Yellowknife, and the majority of people that live in the smaller communities are vastly Indigenous. The next slide will show our communities. There's 33 communities of all. And like I said, nearly 80% of the residents live in these 7 communities that are connected by our road system, which is on the bottom and up towards the west coast of that. 18 of our communities have no road access through the year. They'll get winter roads, and with climate change, as stated earlier, the winter road season is shortening. So their access to getting out of their communities and services into their communities is very limited, some of them only 3 weeks of a year. This means that these communities, 18 of them, are reliant on food being flown into their communities for the majority of the year, at least part-time. And there's also the expense Some of our flights coming into the regional centers or capital city are up to $1,000 just for one flight. And the small communities, there's no jobs. Often in those communities, they'll have one nurse, one RCMP officer, if they're lucky, and a teacher. And people either have to leave their community to get work, or they try to subside on traditional hunting, fishing, but that doesn't, it doesn't buy the new truck, and it doesn't buy the big house. It can sometimes feed their family, but even then it's sometimes a struggle because climate change is affecting us all. The next slide shows, the next slide shows actually, we have a lot of languages in the NWT. These are official languages. We're the only jurisdiction in the whole of Canada that actually recognize Indigenous languages. And we have 9 Indigenous languages that we have. All of our government officials are expected to speak them. We have translators in our departments. So what it's saying is that English is the majority of people in the Northwest Territories, for English is a second language. It's not their first language. The younger generation are growing up speaking English, but the older generation, many don't speak English at all. And so they do rely on word of mouth or what they see on the media and try to interpret themselves. The next slide, slide 7, shows that in 2017 and 18 was the last time we did food insecurity, that it was assessed nationally in Canada. And at that time, the territory had the second highest prevalence of food insecurity at 21.6% of our population. 21% of our population didn't feel that they had the food that necessarily to sustain. That's a result of many factors. It's the remoteness of our communities, transportation, lack of stable employment, and in honesty, the shameful legacy of colonization. So food security means that people have access to a healthy, affordable food that's acceptable to their culture. Risk for food insecurity increases the lack of income. With the lack of income, high cost to transport into the community, and lack of housing. For example, in 2018, 12.6% of residents made less than $30,000 a year. And remembering that making less than $30,000 a year and it costs you $1,000 to get a flight out of your community, you can see on the screen the price of the jug of juice there. The figures just don't add up to actually being able to take care of ourselves properly. Again, Indigenous people are the vast population in the smaller communities, and within those communities, our food insecurity rises higher, up to 50% in at least one of our communities. So it does show in 2018 that over 23% of our residents worried about being able to afford food to feed themselves. And in our smaller communities, it's upward to 60% of the residents worry about having food to be able to feed their families. As well, stated by the federal government officials at the time, the residential schools, the goal of those schools, and I quote, was to take the Indian out of the child. This meant they destructed the traditional way of life for Indigenous people and the traditional foods that we lived in. Residential schools did not teach how to hunt, how to fish, and how to harvest, or how to trap. And so these skills were taken away from Indigenous people. And when the Indigenous children returned to their families, many did not recognize their families or feel welcomed by their families. And there was huge generational disconnect within that. And my generation is still living the tribulations of residential school and the impacts of that. So like I said, I'm going to try to skip through some of this. To really put a face on this, I want to share a story on how it is. So like I said, when there's only 3 or 4 jobs in a community and there are no jobs, then everybody in that community is poor. Many of them live on income support provided by the government to the Northwest Territories, but it's not enough money. So I'm going to share Clara's story. Like I said, my degree is in social work, and every time I see someone that's struggling, my heart goes out and I feel like I need to take them home and feed them or give them money or take care of them. And I've learned from many, many years as a social worker that I can't do that. For one, it's not healthy for my children, it's not healthy for myself, and it's not the best answer. We need to do bigger changes. But I watch people and I still follow because I'm still connected to the NGO world, and I'm still connected to many of the homeless women and low-income families within that. So I want to share Clara's story. about a month ago, Clara's on my Facebook stream. And she said a month ago that they had gotten some money from their band. And because of that, the income support took back money, which is the case. If you get money, you have to take it back. It's the program of last resort, but it's not always the best way of doing business. So Clara had $60 at the beginning of the month. And she lives in one of our most northern communities. People often think that they can live off the land, but Clara's a single grandmother and she has a child that she takes care of. So she doesn't have the access. She can't go out hunting and trapping like people expect. So I watched her day to day and I was worried every day, and I worried about what I was going to do if I was going to actually break my own philosophy and reach out to her and give her money, because money often helps. But I never. I continued to watch, and I figured if it got really dire, then I would. But I never. Each day I watched, and Clara wrote about what she was eating, feeding her grandchild, and actually either begging from neighbors or opening up a can of beans, or whatever it could be. The last day before she got her income support check, she wrote on her Facebook stream, and she said, "I have less than $2 left. And I'm going to go and I'm going to buy dry meat for my grandchild. Sorry, it brings up emotions. I'm going to buy dry meat for my child. And I have a little bit of flour left, and I'm going to make dry meat and bannock for my child to eat." Most of us know that white flour is not the best. And having no fruits and vegetables is not a good option as well. But Clara did her best to provide for her grandchild. So that's one story. And I face these stories all the time. When I ran the homeless shelter, our funding was so limited. We were getting $30,000 a year to feed homeless women, and we were feeding them, bagging hot dogs is what we bought every day. I couldn't imagine eating hot dogs every day for years, but that's all we could afford as a society. So I decided I needed to change, and I ran for politics. Didn't think I'd get in. I wanted homelessness brought to the forefront, but I actually got elected and have kept going forward since then. But so what are we doing since I got in? Well, the first thing I did, in honesty, and that was the last assembly, was I increased the core funding to homeless shelters because I was the Minister of Housing and I had that ability to do that. So I did that across the territory so that homeless shelters didn't have to worry about keeping their own doors open to be able to provide housing for people that had nowhere to sleep. The other things that we've done is all of the MLAs, when we got into this last assembly in 2019, one of our main priorities was to, we're on slide 8. Thanks, was to address food security in the NWT. So we've done a few things. We've committed to local food production to support the food security. We've increasing our country food harvesting. We're working with Canada for more flexibility on the Nutrition North program. I'll explain that later. But we can't do this alone. We all have to work together. That's why we work with the federal government, the Indigenous governments, the municipal governments, and ourselves to be able to make sure that people are getting proper food. So sometimes it really seems simple and easy task. Like I said, that the answer to food insecurity and a lot of being able to choose between unhealthy foods and healthy foods, whether it's misinformation or not, is actually money. But it's not so easy. Like I said, we have a large land base, 33 communities, small population means small tax base. And realistically, I mean, we have programs that we provide, like harvest or agricultural programs and things, but we live in the barren lands. When you come to the NWT in the southern part, we have trees, nothing like BC or Alberta. I'm always like amazed when I go south. It feels like I'm in the tropics. But we have what's called the barrens when you go up halfway through the territories, which means there is not a single tree. There is not a single plant. And so we've set up greenhouses in those communities, but they don't have them. Even getting the greenhouse, the infrastructure there, getting the plants there, taking care of them is a huge expense, actually as much, if not more, than actually in the stores. So it's an issue that we're always facing. And like I said, it impacts people in the north more so, I think, than in the south. I'm going to skip through some of this. I know I'm conscious of time. So people always say Indigenous people can hunt and fish, and that is true. That's part of our culture. Slide 9, thank you. It is part of our culture. However, when we did a survey, because of, like I said, colonization, residential school, social media, people wanting more from watching TV and saying, I don't want to live in my community anymore, I want more. When we did the last survey in 2018, only 42% of the Indigenous residents still went out hunting or fishing, and only 9% went trapping. Of those who hunted and fished, only 24% went out frequently through the year, while almost 37% only went occasionally. So to put that in perspective, 63.6% of residents in 2018 had very little or no access to fish or meat obtained through traditional practices. In the same year, 1998, 21.5% of households in the NWT were eating traditional food. At that year, it was also down by 12.6%. So like I said, not as many people are doing the traditional food, hunting, trapping, smoking fish is what you see, drying fish, actually, drying meat is what you see in this picture. Because of residential school, a lot of those skills were taken away from them. Because of social media, a lot of younger people don't want to learn that culture. They're regaining it, but it's slow. And we don't have the luxury. When you have no trees growing in your communities and there's nothing out there, there's not much options for food, period. So one thing that people need to consider is that the traditional foods go beyond nutrition. It's not only about nutrition that we worry about people harvesting and hunting, it's their culture. It's the retaining their cultural practices, and often even their language is really geared around their day-to-day living, their food, traditional foods. We use the foods traditionally. If we use everything on an animal, we'll use the hides to make clothing, drums, and other traditional things. We would use the brains for tanning our hides. We eat every piece of meat on it. Things that can't be ate, we make into jewelry. So nothing is wasted here. We do have some programs that we are trying to regain the culture, to work with Indigenous people, such as the Take the Family on the Land program. But again, I want to stress that people need to want to do that. And with climate change, the things are moving. Our animals are moving more north. Traditional hunting, within Indigenous culture, we don't write things down. It's a verbal knowledge sharing, which is hard for researchers, I realize, because it's always, you've got to quote everything. But traditional knowledge shares that, our elders will share and say, when you go to hunt this caribou, make sure you miss this, you go by around this rock and you don't go too close to this shoreline or you'll go through the ice. Climate change is changing that. And so our traditional elders are not even able to predict where the animals are anymore or where it's safe to hunt. So that again is making a huge issue on food security. Like I said, we're trying our best in the territories, but we can't do this alone. We're very reliant on the federal government. And so one of the programs the federal government does have is the Nutrition North program. It provides subsidies to people, communities that have no road access for 24/7. So 14 communities in the NWT receive both the Nutrition North subsidy and the Harvesters Support Grant from the GNWT. Only 6 of our communities are eligible for the retail subsidy because they have to be like year-round, no access. And remember, I said that's 3 weeks of the year you can get in there. It's the rest of the year that you can't get in. Although we did make some progress in the last year, in 2021, the Government of Canada, after much lobbying, increased 6 more communities added on to the food security. So slide, I've gone way above you, but slide 12. Just bump through. Slide 12. So Nutrition North does help Northerners. It provides funding for community education programs to build the knowledge and the skills around healthy food choices. And that's often brought into, like when I was in the NGO world, into our prenatal, postnatal programs. However, I do want to say that what I always found is that when we did our pre and postnatal programs, we always talked about misinformation, about reading the labels of what you're eating, making sure you're making healthy choices. But it's really difficult. And I always felt I was putting more blame on low-income families, because if you don't have money to feed your children, and now you're going to a program where they tell you that you shouldn't be giving pop in your children's pop bottles, which is true. But the option is grab that gallon of milk for $30. It puts more blame on the parent, and it's more of a struggle. The Nutrition North program subsidizes retailers so that they can actually provide a lower cost on the shelves. But if you look here on this screen that I have up here now, it's $5.89 for a box of Quaker apples and cinnamon, which is really, it's a small box, it's full of sugar, and it's really not as healthy as people think, and it's almost $6, and that's with the federal subsidy. So as you can see, like I said, even with the subsidies that Canada is giving, the programs that we're doing, people are still in positions where they still can't afford to make those choices. We want to eat better. Residents in the territories want to eat better, but it's really hard to, for one, to access it, and two, how to distinguish what is current information, what is accurate information, and misinformation, as was presented before. When you have misinformation, it leads to unreasonable beliefs that eating certain foods, including supplements. How many of our children went through the time when they were all drinking that energy drinks? I was worried about people. It was like fad. Everybody was drinking them. I don't believe them. I may be wrong, but I don't believe they're healthy. Or combining certain foods that people think will cure diseases or provide health benefits that are not true. For example, we were taught for many years that fresh fruits and vegetables was way healthier than frozen, but we found lately that actually it's more expensive and in the territories, and the frozen foods isn't that bad considering what it is. And in the Northwest Territories, like I said, we're kind of in a food desert. So a lot of our produce is actually brought up from the southern states, from California, from Florida. They're picked green and then they're brought here, and they don't ripen. They rot before they ripen. I've been back here in my home, because I'm from here, for 12 years now, and I haven't eaten a really ripe peach or a pear since I came here. And you're paying like $5 for a peach, and it doesn't even ripe. It rots before it ripes. So that's the things that we have. But like I say, when food and nutrition and misinformation spreads, it's way more difficult to gain the trust of people in the territories, because we've been used as Indigenous people as guinea pigs. We've been mistreated. We've been beaten our history out of us, and we're very reluctant to be able to believe current research, believe politicians, and believe anyone that comes from the academia world in honesty, because of our history. So we need to build that trust again, and we need to reflect on the history of colonization, especially when we're talking about the health of Indigenous people. Skip that. Slide 14 talks about a little bit about what we're doing with the agriculture. Like I said, showing greenhouses in every community. We're trying to go a greenhouse. However, it's more costly than it would be actually to do it down south, and people can't afford to do them in their home yards. So it's one community greenhouse. It doesn't feed the whole community, but it's better than nothing. At least we're starting. As well, slide 15. We do have some programs that we're trying to work with people. Our dietitians are going out trying to provide science-based information to the public as much as possible. But in honesty, we need to get them out of their offices and actually working with people in the field, because not everybody wants to come to a government office, and I wouldn't either if I wasn't in this position. So I think I'm going to stay with that. Slide 16, we do provide financial support to those that are trying to harvest and hunt their own, so that we can build up the the traditional knowledge of hunting and gathering. We also have programs to support local production, and we're really focusing on as much as we can. One of the best programs that we have in the NWT, and I'm not sure if it's throughout Canada, I know that we had trouble getting it, was what's called food rescue. And it was basically a bunch of volunteers went to the grocery stores here in our capital and got the items that they're throwing out, the rotten vegetables and the rotten fruits, and they would take off the bad parts, and then they brought it to the shelters and the daycares. And then our government, before my time, stopped them and said, you can't do that, there's food regulations. And yeah, we have to have food regulations, but we also got to feed people. So one thing that we did in this legislative assembly that I'm proud of as well in the last assembly was that we brought in the legislation so that they can do that. So now that food rescue can go to the stores, take the throw-offs that people are getting rid of because it has a bruise on it. Still good food, but just not sellable, and then giving it out. Again, when we work with pre and postnatal people, I really want to stress any of you that will be going into the field, try to make sure that when you're trying to give them the proper information around eating nutritious, around not giving pop to your children, using whatever it may be, remembering that they might not have the income to make that choice. They might know they want to do better, but they might not be able to afford it. So being part of the solution and not part of the problem. I guess on that, like I said, we're doing some things to help, but it's not enough. We're a small population. We have a small tax base. We're vast land and too many communities, and none of them want to combine. So it means that our money doesn't go far enough, which makes us really reliant on the federal government. So I hope that on that, I'll switch to page 17. I hope that as we go through, people will realize that we do need to work with misinformation. People need to be aware of what they're getting and what is in the packaging that they're buying. But we also have to make people make sure that we don't make people feel less than, because if they can't afford it to begin with, then we're not doing any service by actually making them feel that they have to make sure that they get that $30 gallon of milk versus that $5 can of pop. And because if we do that, they will isolate and they won't come for help. And then we're talking about the most vulnerable people facing in the territories, huge diabetes, obesity, like was said, rotten teeth, all of the things that are health detriments. So a direct link between poverty and food security and the information and the choice what to do when we do have the current information. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting presentation. And I think you made really excellent points about the legacy of colonialism, residential schools, and the importance of finding ways to work towards reconciliation and trust in order to be able to communicate information. But if we don't deal with issues of food accessibility first, then there really is no point of even communicating information, because there's no choice to be made if food isn't accessible. So with that, I think it'll be really interesting to hear from someone who used to work in the federal government. And I'd like to pass the floor to Dr. Hutchinson. The floor is yours, Dr. Hutchinson, and just wait a minute for Soledad to load your slides.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It has been a very exciting afternoon already, and I've really enjoyed being able to talk, listen to Jean-Claude and Premier Cochran, who've gone through some themes that really have been part of my life for the last 25 years as well. So I really would like to thank you for the opportunity to provide some remarks on nutrition misinformation. I'm very pleased to be here to discuss that issue. But before starting, I really want to acknowledge that I live in Nuxlelequim, which is also known as Bowen Island in the settler terminology. And that's in Akatsum Howe Sound, close to Vancouver, in the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation, the Musqueam Nation, and the Tsleil-Waututh. So if we go to the next slide, it's just the outline slide there. Today, basically, I'm going to hopefully quickly run through why this topic of misinformation is important, why it matters, to go through some governance and roles for nutrition in Canada, and then discuss a couple of initiatives, the Healthy Eating Strategy and the Food Guide revision, that will illustrate some progress made by Health Canada. I should point out, as you already have actually, that I no longer work for Health Canada and I'm no longer a spokesperson for them. So don't interpret what I'm saying to be government policy, which is kind of more fun now to be released from that obligation to stay on what is really the government record. The next slide here is about why healthy eating information matters, and of course the importance of promoting healthy eating and the challenge posed by nutrition-related chronic diseases have never been greater. And we've heard that both from Jean-Claude and from Premier Cochran. Today, more than 1 in 5 Canadians live with chronic diseases, and rates are rising every year. And even more disturbing is that risk conditions like obesity and hypertension are now starting to show up in children. Well, not just starting, they are showing up in children. The science has established again and again that poor diet is a primary risk factor for these conditions. But it's not always easy to understand and use the information, and the health eating messages are often conflicting. Canadians need to know where to go to get credible information. In the next slide, this little cartoon, which should pop up in a second. Soledad. There we go. As illustrated in this cartoon, so much of the information is nothing more than fiction, not really based on good science at all. I'm not going to say more about that, really. Let's just move on so we can have time for discussion. And part of the problem here is that there are so many actors affecting our information environment. And this would be fine if all the different actors were reinforcing each other and giving consistent, credible advice, but this is rarely the case. This erodes public confidence in our healthy eating system. And you see here, of course, I've just grouped some different areas, academics, health professionals, celebrities and influencers, the different levels of government, industry, NGOs and health charities. And certainly Jean-Claude has talked very eloquently about the effect of industry and how that information can often be, what was the terminology he used? You get disinformation, can get disinformation from industry, and misinformation, certainly celebrities and influencers, what you often see from them, I don't think would be as much the lies and disinformation as much as misinformation going on. But then there are also between these different groups, there are huge discrepancies in the ability to reach Canadians with the information that they are giving out. Celebrities and influencers far outpace the ability of Health Canada to reach consumers. And from a monetary perspective, Health Canada has really quite a paltry annual budget for nutrition promotion. I mean, it's rarely even close to $100 million over a year. But you can contrast that to industry, where someone like McDonald's Canada alone spends over $70 million on advertising from 2017. Or if you go to the whole Canadian food and beverage industry as a whole, which spends around 1.1 billion each year on the marketing of food and beverages to children, resulting in kids seeing an estimated 1,500 ads annually on social media alone. And very little of this advertising is for foods that we consider healthy. So the consumer, the Canadians are just being hit with all of these messages about food. And I would say that most of them are really not right. And it's hard, but it becomes very confusing, very hard for the consumer to decide which are the right ones and which are not. Another complication we can see in the next slide here is that even when you look at the governance side of things, we have a very distributed governance and set of roles for nutrition in Canada. Different people are responsible for different sorts of actions. When you see the differences between the feds and between the provinces and the territories and at the municipal level as well. But even in the federal government, we operate somewhat in silos between the folks who develop the dietary guidance, the communication and promotion, the regulations and standards, and program delivery, among other things. So even at the level of the federal government, you can often get somewhat conflicting, or have been able to get somewhat conflicting advice. And this is partially why Health Canada launched what we call the the Comprehensive Healthy Eating Strategy back in October 2016. And on the next slide, you'll see a somewhat complicated diagram of this. And this healthy eating strategy includes important commitments to promote public health by restricting the marketing of unhealthy foods and beverages to children, eliminating trans fat and reducing salt, and improving labeling on packaged foods, including the front of pack labeling initiatives that both Jean-Claude and also I think Emma, you were wondering about where we were with front of pack. I'll get to that in a little bit about what the present status is on that. So these complementary, mutually reinforcing initiatives will make it easier for Canadians to make healthier choices for themselves and their families. You know, for instance, if you take the situation of going shopping, the whole experience of going shopping, we want to make it easier for Canadians by, say, using the revised food guide for planning, by using tools such as the updated nutrition facts table and the proposed front of package labels to select healthier foods, and by having a food supply with lower amounts of sodium and no industrial trans fats. I believe it was Premier Cochran who was talking about the cereals. I mean, really, I have to agree with you, Premier Cochran. I mean, you go down a cereal aisle and it's really just packaged candy there that somehow gets, through advertising, gets promoted as being healthy. And that's not completely true, of course. There are some good healthy cereals in there as well. But it's hard to tell which ones are and which ones aren't. And that's why we were looking at what would be the effects of having front of package labels that very clearly differentiate that. So what we did then, starting back in 2016, was to bring together our various policy tools and to use them in a much more coordinated way. So policy tools such as information, education, legislation, regulation, guidelines, standards, procedures, and programs, basically breaking down the silos that I was talking about earlier and working in a fundamentally different way, and also by using a strong common evidence base. So really at the level of the federal government, really to work together and to think about how you can get consistent messages and support each other no matter which sort of policy tool that you're using. So sort of make those linkages. So this has resulted in much more coherent approaches to address public health nutrition issues. Now, on the next slide, it talks a little bit about, what sort of progress have we made in our healthy eating strategy, and certainly with respect to improving the basic nutrition labeling, the side of pack nutrition facts table, banning trans fats, and the new food guide. Those have all been released and they have been happening. But what has come up a couple of times have been talking about the front of pack nutrition labeling as well as the marketing to kids. And I'm not part of them anymore. The federal government has certainly done a tremendous amount of work in preparing an approach to look at front of package nutrition labeling. And that basically it was ready to be promulgated back in 2019, but it got stuck on the order paper, basically meaning that in 2019, when the election was called, it had not sort of gone through there. Sorry, that wasn't not the front of pack, but the front of pack wasn't the regulations weren't promulgated because we ran into an election period. But everything had been so delayed on that. That was ready to be released much earlier as well. Probably as in 2018, we could have released the front of pack stuff, but there was so much feedback and pressure from the food industry to not do that. And so that really slowed everything down. And in a similar way, in the marketing to kids, that was down to a bill that was ready to had gone through the House of Commons back in 2018. And this is, the one that died on the order table or the order paper in the Senate with the election call in 2019. But once again, we had in the Senate, there was a filibustering that happened from a conservative senator that was basically due to pressure from the food industry not wanting to have marketing to regulations against marketing of unhealthy foods and beverages to kids. Now, for both of those issues, I have been pleasantly surprised to see that they are both part of the mandate letter to the present Minister of Health, that was sent, I think, back in the most recent one back in December. And so those are things that the Prime Minister has assigned to the Minister of Health to work on. Marketing to kids. There is a new bill that has gone to the House of Commons, and it went for first reading just back in February. So that is back on track. And I hear rumors that we might be, because it's part of the mandate letter that has gone to the Minister of Health, then hopefully we'll be seeing the front of package nutrition labeling. That will make things much easier for the consumer when you're shopping, and the marketing to kids would be great to stop the marketing of unhealthy foods and beverages to kids. Now let's switch over to the next slide. We'll concentrate on the food guide. Revising the food guide was a fundamental component of the healthy food strategy. And front and center for the revision was the importance of gaining the confidence of trust of health professionals and the public. We certainly did not have that with the previous version of the food guide. The 2007 version was viewed as lacking in a strong evidence base, too influenced by industry, not useful for either health professionals or the public, and sadly out of date as a communication and messaging tool. So we took a very comprehensive approach to addressing the trust problem. The next slide, the first, we looked at the evidence base, and we developed a strong, validated methodology to gather the best available evidence from high quality scientific reports originating from respected authorities. By setting the evidence bar very high and using strong, convincing evidence as the groundwork for the food guide, we ensured that health professionals and Canadians understood that this was rooted in the best evidence that we have. And we published this information so it was available for all to see. Next slide. Secondly, what we looked at was we consulted and listened extensively during the development of the food guide to the provinces and territories, to the national Indigenous organizations, to professional regulatory bodies, researchers and academics, the health charities. And we listened as well directly to Canadians in online consultations and focus groups. Meeting with all these stakeholders several times throughout the development of the guide meant that we effectively co-created the new food guide based on what was important for its implementation. And by this co-creation, these groups are more invested in using the final products, which leads to Canadians hearing more consistent messages from different sources. So whether you're hearing the messages from the Heart and Stroke Foundation, from Diabetes Canada, from provincial governments, from us, from the federal government, or from other groups, the right messages that have been studied and have the best evidence base are available. And in the way that we did our consultations, we hope that people, because they were involved and we really listened to what we got, then people would be working together and they would be implementing it. So for instance, the guide now acts as a policy piece integrated by federal, provincial, and territorial governments into their nutrition programs and regulations. As a result, it influences the types of food that are served and sold in public institutions such as daycares, schools, hospitals, and long-term care facilities. Next slide. Third, what we did is we controlled for the impression of undue industry influence and conflicts of interest in a number of ways, by excluding industry commissioned reports from being considered for the evidence base, by not using as advisors any researchers whose studies were directly funded by industry, and by not meeting or communicating directly with any industry group during the development of the food guide. So there were no backroom discussions with lobbyists about commercial interests. And Jean-Claude talked very eloquently about the evidence about all of these different effects and how that can change what is developed with respect to policy. And we did a number of steps to control it. So this policy of controlling for conflict of interest was tremendous important in making sure that you really had the right information there, but it's important as well, it was important as well in gaining the trust of Canadians and the trust of health professionals, because then you know that when you come to the food guide and the related materials, these are not affected by commercial interests. And fourth, we updated completely our communications and messaging. We should skip into the next slide now. there we go, yeah. We got rid of the old prescriptive one-size-fits-all approach to healthy eating. We replaced it with an entire suite of tools and resources for consumers, healthcare professionals, and policy makers. The food guide now is made up of healthy food recommendations and recipes, meal planning, tips for eating at various life stages, advice for different cultural groups, and certainly Premier Cochran, you were talking about the necessity for realizing how important it was for traditional foods. There is a lot of that in the documents of the food guide, the different sorts of documents about the necessity of that, and also very much a lot of discussion about reconciliation and the effect of residential schools on the culture and the passing of skills and knowledge about preparation of traditional foods and the effect that will have on the health of Indigenous peoples. That's there as well. So there's much more there as well. There's a lot there. And in the next slide, it's that, you know, we listened to them saying that this was not sort of out of date approach to that. All of this information about the food guide is available as a modern, dynamic, web-based application where you can easily access the type and depth of the information you want, whether you're wanting the details of the evidence base or tips about how to involve your kids in meal planning and food preparation, and resources like healthy recipes, as I mentioned above. There's so much there you really have to take the time to go in and to check out what is in the food guide. And again, everything's so strongly based on the evidence. The next slide, I believe, is really just pointing out that, you know, for me, all these elements, having a solid evidence base, engaging and listening, being very aware of possible conflicts of interest and commercial interests, and developing relevant, accessible messages and communications were important for gaining confidence and trust. And most important, the food guide and related materials provide an authoritative source for accurate nutrition information for all stakeholders, a tool to help us declutter that food information environment and give Canadians consistent messages, no matter the source. I'll just end with, on the next slide, there's an article that I ran across just yesterday, an article from Dr. Tim Caulfield, who's a professor in law at University of Alberta in Edmonton. And he had this, he talks quite often about disinformation, misinformation. And he gave a talk where he talked about the do's and don'ts of debunking false science. And now his talk was in the context of the COVID misinformation, but the tips that he ended with, I thought apply very well when you're dealing with nutrition misinformation as well. And if you just certainly the first 4 or 5 there really were the steps that we did take when we were working on both the food guide and then the broader healthy eating strategy as well. Providing the science, using clear shareable content, reference trustworthy and independent sources, if possible, reference expert consensus, which we used a lot. We must have used well over 100 different sorts of scientists, but not scientists who had been funded by industry. And you know, there are other steps there as well. But I thought this was a really good piece, and I put the link there too about to get to Tim Caulfield's information. It was really very good. So I'm going to end there because I'm saying, you know, we really only have 10 minutes now to get back to our panel discussion, and I'm sure that there are sorts of there are lots of questions that we would like to answer and have some discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so since we only have 10 minutes left, I want to ask all the attendees to go and upvote the question that they want answered the most, so that we can prioritize the ones with the most upvotes. I'm going to start with a question from Nadine. She's asking this to Dr. Mubarak, but I think anyone is open to answer it. She's curious what regulatory and legislative approaches could rein in deceptive practices by private sector entities. So I think that you mentioned some, Dr. Hutchinson, about not letting, for example, lobbyists from the private sector influence things such as the Canada Food Guide. But I'm wondering what other approaches do any of the panelists have? And you can just jump in or raise your hand if you'd like. Okay.
Well, I think this, oh, certainly, Jean-Claude, go ahead.
Okay, Hassan, I'll just quickly, I think that a first step is to explain to Canadian what is going on. I think by explaining what's going on and making it public, we will prevent some of it. Because in the end, I think a bad press is always something that industry wants to avoid. So if the public understand that they're being fooled in a way that there are some actors that are funding research to provide information that is opposite to what the science is showing, if we explain to them the pressure and the influence of the lobbying and all the actions against the food policies, such as the food marketing bill and the front of package labeling, I think this is one step to explain to Canadian what's going on and then see what happens. But too often, those relationships are being kept in the dark. And when they are released publicly, then we see that the actors are, stop behaving in such ways. So I think by making it publicly available information and by explaining to Canadian what's going on, it's a necessary first step. But definitely what Health Canada did with the food guide to protect the food guide development without exposing it to conflict of interest is a must. And it's a new standard in the development of food guidelines.
Yeah, that's very good. You know, Jean-Claude, it made me think of something else that we did under openness and transparency. And this is not just for the food guide, but across the whole healthy eating strategy, is that anytime there was any correspondence with, and not just with my group in the Office of Nutrition Policy and Promotion, but anyone who is developing any aspect of healthy eating strategy, right all the way up into the Deputy Minister, we published that correspondence on an open database. And so when industry was going in and talking to the Deputy Minister and Assistant Deputy Minister, writing their letters, and well, we just put it up on the database so everybody can see. And certainly there are some scientists who've done an analysis of those thousands of different sorts of inputs that have come in. And that's out of, I guess I'm thinking of Mary LeBay, who used to be the chair of nutrition at the University of Toronto, has in the last year or so has published some analysis of the type of information that comes in to try and influence the policy direction. And I think you're absolutely right. The more we get that sort of information out there, the more people will be astounded at the type of influence that industry tries to put on that.
Very, very interesting. In the sake of time, I'm going to move to the next question. So this is a question more geared towards Premier Cochran. Is there any governmental program or incentive to promote traditional hunting, fishing, or to promote traditional knowledge related to food in the Northwest Territories? I think you mentioned some in your presentation, but if you wouldn't mind giving a little bit more details about that.
Yeah, we do. We are trying to regain the traditional hunting practices of people. We have many programs, take a child hunting. We provide funding to schools, etc., to do that. But I have to stress that, like I said, only 42% in 2018 of Indigenous people up here, and we're very traditional up here. We're actually still doing traditional hunting and trapping. The problem is that, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but everybody thinks that, oh, we're Indigenous people and that we should just be able to live off the land. It's easy. Go and hunt, teach us to hunt. But we don't ask that of non-Indigenous people. And so I do think that, if it's a bit of a colonistic approach again, when we think that we can just tell people you're Indigenous, you should be able to take off your clothes, run barefoot through the woods and be able to take care of yourself, because we can't. It's been beaten out of us. We went through residential school, we went through colonization, and we've lost a lot of those skills. So the territorial government is trying to do what we can to promote those again, but we have to accept that not everybody's going to want to live that life. You know, like I said, our youth are watching TV. They're seeing Britney Spears and people that are, you know, high fashion, driving nice cars. Why can't they have that? Why do we expect that Indigenous people have to live a traditional way? So we're trying to respect that and trying to promote that, but at the same time, respecting that people live in a different society and that we have to meet people where they are. When we talk about policy changes too, I think that we need to make sure that it's clear. A lot of times I just picked up a label off of soy and iced tea, probably really unhealthy for me. Good thing you can't see it on the screen. But, you know, I don't know what half these things are, but I do. I remember when I was teaching pre and postnatal classes, I said, look at the first 3 ingredients, because you might not understand them all, but, you know, that's really what it is. And the first 3 ingredients on this is water, sugar, and acid. Is it healthy? I don't know. The water's good.
I think that your statements
Water's great.
Your statements lead well into the next question, which is, what does the linguistic profile of your citizens affect the issue of nutrition, dis/misinformation? Does your office have access to all these languages to understand what information myths might be circulating through the communities? And I guess also to communicate with the different linguistic profiles, nutrition information.
Yeah, so like I said, we have 11 official languages, French and English being 2 of them, 9 Indigenous languages. As many words as we can are translated. People, not all of us speak all languages. Some of us Indigenous don't even speak our own languages, but we do have translators available. The problem is I speak English and I've been raised on English all my life, and I'm just looking for, you know, I'm not 100% sure what sodium citrate is or stevia extract is. You know, some of these things are in English. I don't understand what they are. So if there's not a word for it, Indigenous languages are based, like I said, around culture, around original practices. If we never had these things, even citric acid in our language, we never, you know, we didn't have fruit. So how do we expect to translate a word that there's no meaning in the Indigenous language? And when you have elders that don't speak English, or new immigrants that are coming, you know, throughout Canada and into the NWT, they don't speak the language. So it's not as easy as just putting out the current information. It's making sure that somehow we address the language barriers that are out there. So I'll end on that.
Okay, so right before we leave, I think I want to just add a really quick question about the new warning labels that have been, you mentioned them, Dr. Hutchinson. I've been seeing some articles that they want to put labels on foods that are high in salt, saturated fat, and sugar. So what impact do you think this will have? And do you think this will force companies to reformulate their products to make them a bit healthier? Rapid, like 20-second response.
Yeah, well, yes, I guess is what I'm very hopeful that I think this could actually have a very big effect. And this has been done in some other countries, and in Chile and in Mexico, they've been doing this approach. And you have seen a fair amount of reformulation that has happened in those countries where they have done that. And if you're really looking for more information on that, there's some great work out of the World Cancer Research Fund International, where they look at those sorts of interventions, and you can find out what has worked, what hasn't worked. And there's actually a wonderful, about a 60-page report on different approaches that have been taking part for the front of pack that's available. Great resource. Takes more than 20 seconds to read though.
Okay, well, with that, I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the audience questions, but I really want to thank the panelists from the bottom of my heart for volunteering your time to come and talk with us today. It was really, really interesting. We'll be preparing a report about the forum that we will publish on our website and distribute through our social medias and share with you, as well as the recording of the forum will be available online. So with that, I'd like to pass it off to Soledad to make the final closing remarks.
Thank you very much. So I want to thank Jean-Claude, Hassan, Caroline for volunteering your time and your diverse perspectives on this issue. This was a very interesting conversation on a subject that is very dear to me. And I personally think that it is our duty as scientists to take a stand and combat misinformation. We also want to thank the audience today for their participation and insightful questions. And I want especially to thank the Canadian Nutrition Society for promoting this event. Our team of volunteers at Science and Policy Exchange will prepare a report based on the key points and recommendations highlighted during this forum. This public forum is the first in a two-part series about food. The next forum will take place in the fall, this fall, on the topic of food security in Canada, something that Premier Cochran touched about today. SPE is a nonprofit that is 100% run by volunteers who are passionate about science and policy issues. And we are always accepting new volunteers, so reach out if you like to get involved. Finally, thank you all at Science and Policy Exchange, volunteers and the public forum coordinators who diced, chopped and rolled out this event to promote dialogue on this important topic. Special thanks to Emma Anderson, the mastermind who actually had to take over today and guide the discussion. We wish you all the best in your new position as policy analyst at Natural Resources Canada. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone a good night, and we hope to see you all in the next forum of SPE. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Soledad.